It started like any ordinary day in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Sunny skies, trimmed lawns, and that one neighbor who always finds something to complain about. But things took a wild turn when a local veteran, just walking his service dog through the community he's lived in for years, was stopped by someone who's gained quite the reputation, the HOA president, often called Deborah. She didn't just question his dog, she mocked it loudly, publicly. She claimed the dog wasn't a real service animal and that it was just an excuse to break HOA rules. What she didn't expect was that this veteran had backup, and not just any kind. As the tension built and neighbors started watching from their windows, the veteran calmly made a call. Within the hour, the street was filled with a surprising sight. Not one, not two, but an entire K-9 unit arriving in support. The looks, the whispers, the silence that fell over Deborah's usually loud voice. It was one of those moments where everyone knew something big was about to happen. But no one was ready for just how powerful the response would be. What unfolded next turned the whole neighborhood upside down and left Deborah with a lesson she wouldn't forget. Deborah had always been strict about the rules. Some say too strict, from measuring lawn height with a ruler to handing out warnings for wind chimes that were too loud. She had made herself the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA. So when she saw the veteran walking with his service dog, a calm, well-trained black Labrador named Shadow, she didn't see years of military service or the bond between a handler and his dog. She just saw what she believed was a violation, and she was ready to make a scene. The veteran, a quiet man named David Miller, didn't argue. He simply explained that Shadow was his certified PTSD service dog, trained to help him manage anxiety and night terrors. But Deborah wasn't having it. She raised her voice, questioning the dog's legitimacy, accusing David of faking it, and even threatening fines. A small group of neighbors started to gather, sensing the tension. Some tried to calm her down, but Deborah wouldn't back off. That's when David took a step back, pulled out his phone, and made a calm but firm call. No yelling, no threats, just a few words. Not long after, the hum of SUVs began to echo through the streets. One by one, trained K-9 officers and their handlers stepped out, and the mood shifted completely. Deborah's expression changed, but the show was just getting started. The moment the K-9 unit began filing out of their vehicles, the entire neighborhood seemed to freeze. It wasn't just one or two handlers, it was a full team. Each officer walked with a service dog by their side, all calm, focused, and clearly highly trained. Deborah stepped back slightly, her voice finally quiet for once. She wasn't expecting this kind of support, and definitely not on her own street. David didn't say much. He just stood quietly beside Shadow, who sat obediently at his feet. Neighbors who had once stayed out of HOA business were now stepping closer, whispering among themselves. Some recorded on their phones. Others were shaking their heads, finally seeing for themselves how far Deborah had gone. Among the crowd was a young mom named Jessica, who had been fined last month for having sidewalk chalk on her driveway. She'd always felt targeted but kept her head down to avoid more trouble. Now, watching David stand firm with an entire K-9 unit backing him, she felt something shift. One of the officers approached Deborah, not aggressively, but with a serious, calm presence. He explained the rights of service dog handlers under the ADA and reminded her that interfering could result in legal consequences. Deborah tried to save face, insisting she was just doing her job. But behind her eyes, it was clear. This was spinning out of her control, and what happened next would make sure she never forgot it. The tension was thick in the air now. The usually quiet cul-de-sac had turned into something out of a movie scene. Marked police vehicles lined the street, K-9 officers speaking calmly among themselves, and neighbors standing in stunned silence. Deborah, still trying to hold on to whatever authority she thought she had, started flipping through her HOA rulebook right there on the sidewalk. Her voice trembled slightly as she pointed to vague wording about non-approved animals, but it was clear she was grasping at straws. David stayed silent, letting the officers handle it. Shadow didn't move an inch, his eyes locked on his handler, alert but calm. One of the senior K-9 officers, a woman with decades of experience, began calmly walking the neighborhood with her dog, pointing out how service dogs are trained not just for support, but also for real-time crisis response. She explained how David and Shadow had worked together overseas, how their bond wasn't just legal, it was life-saving. Deborah didn't respond. Then something unexpected happened. Another neighbor stepped forward, an older man with a cane who revealed he too was a veteran. He'd stayed quiet for years to avoid trouble with Deborah and the HOA. But now, seeing David take a stand, he spoke up, and once he did, more voices followed. The crowd shifted. Lines were being drawn. And Deborah, she was suddenly very, very alone. What came next would leave the entire block speechless. Just when it seemed like the neighborhood had fully turned against Deborah, another unexpected twist hit. This time from within the HOA itself. A man in a suit, holding a folder, walked briskly toward the crowd. He introduced himself as an attorney hired by a group of homeowners who had quietly been documenting Deborah's actions for months. Apparently, this confrontation with David and the service dog was just the tipping point. The lawyer opened the folder and handed Deborah a formal notice, an official complaint signed by over a dozen residents, including video footage and written testimonies of her past behavior. Everything from unjust fines to discriminatory comments was listed. The service dog incident had pushed things too far, and now it was no longer just a neighborhood dispute, it was legal. Deborah's face went pale. She tried to argue, claiming she'd been protecting the community and just following protocol, but no one was buying it anymore. One neighbor pulled out their phone and played a video from earlier that day, Deborah mocking David's PTSD, claiming people like him shouldn't live here if they need a dog to function. The crowd gasped. Even some of her former supporters stepped back. David still hadn't said a word. He stood beside Shadow, steady as ever, while the weight of years of tension in the neighborhood finally came to the surface. But this wasn't over yet. What happened next would take everything to a whole new level. The street was silent as Deborah stared at the paperwork in her hands. For once, she had no comeback, no speech, no threats. The lawyer calmly explained that the HOA board would be holding an emergency vote to remove her as president, effective immediately. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't boo. They just watched. The weight of years of frustration finally beginning to lift. It felt like the neighborhood was exhaling all at once. Deborah opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, another officer stepped forward with something no one expected, a body cam clip from an earlier encounter. The footage showed Deborah approaching David weeks ago, same spot, same dog, mocking him then, too. It wasn't a one-time incident, it was a pattern. The clip ended with David walking away without saying a word, just like he did today. The twist? That footage had already been shared with a local veterans' rights group, and they were now involved, planning legal action on David's behalf. Deborah backed away slowly, her voice barely a whisper. She wasn't just losing her position, she was facing public accountability for every decision she tried to hide behind HOA rules.